Welcome to the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. My name is Martin Kragh, head of the Russia program here at the Institute and the moderator for today's event. It is my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers here today. Andrey Zubov is professor of history, previously with the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, MGIMO, from where he was expelled in 2014 after his criticism of Russia's annexation of Crimea. Zubov, who is now an independent researcher, is an expert on Russian history of religion, the author and editor of a much acclaimed 2-volume textbook called A History of Russia, and an astute observer of today's Russia's political development. Standing next to Professor Zubov is Anna-Lena Laurén, Moscow correspondent for 2 daily newspapers, Dagens Nyheter here in Sweden and Hufvudstadsbladet in Finland. Laurén has covered Russia and the former Soviet republics for a number of years and is the author of books on Ukraine and the Caucasus, among other things. Today's theme, Russia's domestic challenges, is deliberately broad. Russia is currently undergoing political and economic change, in some respects dramatic, while at the same time Russia has taken on a new foreign policy role, much more assertive and aggressive on a level which we have not seen before. Both our speakers will have about 20 minutes each for presentation and discussion, after which we will open up to the auditorium for questions and feedback. Andrey Borisovich, пожалуйста.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, for me it's a great pleasure and very serious obligation to speak with you in this wonderful institute where so many people who are much more educated than me spoke on the different problems and problems of Russia as one of it. Thank you very much for this kind invitation. It's a honor. As to speak about current Russia. Russia now, when I visit some international forums, some security forums, some conferences on current politics, I very often hear that Russia is an unpredictable country and produce a lot of danger for the outside world. Among main dangers, for example, of United States, Russia is with Iran, North Korea, and China. And why it's so? I remember very well that 10, maybe 15 years ago, Russia was not an unpredictable country. First years after the decline of communist regime, it was a great interest for Russia, but then this interest disappeared. And my colleagues, specialists in Russian history and Russian politics in the Western universities, they very often say that, oh, now we seem that we ought to change our job. Nobody go to Russian special courses among students, so Russia is out of interest because it's predictable. You try to construct democratic system, of course with a lot of difficulties. You try to build market economy, of course with many problems, but you're on the right direction. You are not dangerous country, you are one among us. Of course, a lot of problems, but it's understandable. Russia is understandable. It was the main world in the end of 19th and the beginning of the third millennium. Now the situation is changed. It was dramatically changed in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea and the start of conflict war between Russia and Ukraine in Ukraine. And step by step after this, we see more and more complicated, more and more unpredictable situation. The military support of Al-Assad regime is another step which was made half a year ago, and it produced new great problems for all the world and for Europe especially because of great amounts of migrants. Why Russia changed its politics? Why it, from predictable country, turned to be unpredictable? It was unpredictable when it was Soviet Union. During the Soviet Union time, Soviet Union was really unpredictable, but less unpredictable than today's Russia. During the Soviet time, we know very well what Soviet leaders may do and what they may do never. Do not do never. Now it's impossible to predict, not only by current public, but also by us, specialists in this field. We also can say anything. So, for me, for example, this annexation of Crimea was a shock. I never supposed that Mr. Putin would do such a step. The military assistance to Al-Assad regime, it was also a shock, because I never could predict it. And but why now? Of course, you see, there are political gurus who think about future, but real political scientists, they think about the past, of course, and try to explain what had occurred already. For me, now it's the problem why all the things occurred. And the answer is clear for me. You see, if we compare post-communist countries of the Central Europe with post-communist states of former Soviet Union, except Baltic states, which are, of course, much more closer to the Central European countries, of post-communist Central European countries, in their ways out of communism. We see one very clear dimension, very clear distinction between these two groups of countries. Post-communist countries of the Central Europe, Central is, of course, not special term. It's from Serbia and Bulgaria in the south to Estonia and former GDR in the north. So all these countries made special steps, different from country to country, but special steps in the road of complete and systematic decommunization. You see that political elites changed dramatically. After this Velvet Revolution, for example, in Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, dissident, prisoner during the communist period, turned to be a president. Lech Walesa in Poland, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, and other men of the same origin. In economics, not only market economy, but restitution of property rights. It's a very serious step, because simple people of the street, they fail to understand these words about democracy in itself. They ought to see what is a democracy for them. And for simple people, democracy and decommunization means returning of property of their fathers, grandfathers to them. And we see that in all countries of former communist world, South Central Europe, this restitution of property rights took part in different way. There are very many differences between Czech Republic and Poland, for example, but it was. The third is lustration. Lustration, of course. Former communist elite, especially KGB, secret police elite, was for Stasi in GDR. They were forbidden to return to politics. Once again, from country to country, laws are different, but the idea is the same. The fourth is the change of historical cultural pattern. Heroes of communist regime, such as Dimitrov, for example, in Bulgaria, Gottwald in Czechoslovakia, they disappeared from their mausoleums, and their mausoleums were disappeared also. And the names of the streets were changed, were returned the pre-communist historical names of the cities, of the streets, etc. And of course, textbooks in history were changed dramatically for schools and universities. And the fourth, maybe the last but not the least, is the change in the attitude to the political immigration. A lot of people who ought to leave their countries because of the communist regime and their successors, their sons and daughters, were not only allowed to return, but they will be able to they could return automatically. So they go to embassy and they take national passport. National passport was returned to them, and since there was a restitution of property, they returned to some property. So it was a complete decommunization. Nothing like this was made in all other Soviet republics, from Belarus and Ukraine and Moldavia up till Central Asia and Transcaucasian, even in Georgia, with all its democratic regime. Maybe not many people in Europe were interested in this. But it was a dramatical difference, because this complete systematic decommunization of Central Europe produced immediate effect. These countries turned to be a part of European Union, they turned to be a part of NATO, and communists lost their possibilities to return to power. Of course, some of them try, as Kwasniewski, for example, in Poland, but with no good results. And in this system, he could come to power, but he failed to return Soviet system. He returned to power in different countries, in different Poland. And in the countries where this complete decommunization not only was finished, but was not started even, former political elites, step by step, returned to old understanding of reality. This old understanding of reality doesn't mean that the communist regime returned. Of course not. Because the main principle of communist regime is a common property, as Professor Samuelson showed us in his wonderful books. This common property, of course, did not return and never will return. It's understandable, because all these leaders, former KGB officers and generals, and communist and Komsomol, Young Communist League leaders of Eastern Europe, of former Soviet republics, they turned to be a very rich person. And they possessed a lot of private property. And they will not return even a penny, even a cent to state. It's understandable. And the main problem is how to preserve this private property. The main problem of today's Russian elite is how to preserve this property which was taken in previous 2 decades. And the way of preservation of private property is the way of returning to authoritarian state. It's impossible to preserve private property in the hands of small group of people in a really democratic country. Because sooner or later, the vast majority of population ask why you possess everything if our grandfathers lost everything during the communist revolution, and you, former Soviet leaders, you took this, our common property, took parts of it and take to your pockets. Why? The only way out in preservation of property is to re-establish authoritarian regime. And since the memory of these people, of the people of Russian today's elite, is a communist memory. They studied in Soviet KGB schools, in Soviet party schools. So they return to authoritarian state in Soviet style. You see, that's why, for example, Stalin is a hero of today's elite Russia, and you know that it's impossible to imagine, but one after one, these monuments of Stalin re-established in Russian Federation. You know that some days ago, monument of Stalin was built in Pskovskaya gubernia, before it in Arkhangelsk, and in other places of Russia. It's impossible to understand. You see, for Russian people, I mean not only ethnical Russia, but for all people of Russia, Stalin did as much bad things as Hitler did for Jews. And I know that here in this hall is a counselor of Israel embassy, and how can we imagine that a monument for Hitler will be erected in Israel? It's impossible. But why the murder of millions of Russians is now erected in Russia, and a lot of Lenin's monuments and Lenin mausoleum, as it was during the communist regime, it continued to be. So we now see the mixture of 2 different forms of organization of authoritarian power. In culture, it is a restitution of Soviet mentality. In economics, is a building of corporate authoritarian state of Mussolini fashion. So it's not Nazi state, but it's fascist state. Nationalistic with corporate economy, authoritarian rule in politics, and very close relations between state and the church, as it was in Mussolini regime, and very close relations with this fascist regime and history of the country. You remember that Mussolini, though he was a socialist and Republican-minded person, he agreed to preserve kingship and royal regime in Italy because it's a connection in history. So this idea, connection in history, concordat with the church, all property in the hands of the friends of Duce, authoritarian regime, and nationalistic slogans, and wars for colonies, as it was in Libya, in Ethiopia, Abyssinia, you remember. So we see this mixture in Russia, but not only in Russia. Even in Ukraine, though you see independent state with the mood to go to Europe, we see the same situation in concrete forms. No one person say about all Lenin monuments were destructed. but no word was pronounced about restitution of property. No word. Though in Western Ukraine no longer was Soviet rule and annexation of property as in Central European countries. But no one word was said. You see, so we see everywhere here the same form of mentality. And the last, my idea, is for Europe. What to do in Europe with this state, with this group of states. Since no decommunization was made, recommunization occurred. Now we see, you see here in Europe, a new authoritarian, rather aggressive, nationalistic, unpredictable group of states in the former Soviet Union territory. What to do with them? I think it's impossible to agree that these regimes will continue to survive. It's necessary to do what is possible in peaceful and legal forms to change situation. In Russia, we have some groups of people, some groups of liberal opposition, who think about this direction to Europe, but also without complete decommunization. No Yavlinsky, no Kasyanov, neither Kasyanov say about this complete decommunization. They can't understand it. But this is the main problem. I think that as today's Europe could be organized after the Second World War only after denazification of Germany, and without complete denazification of Germany, no European market could be built in 50s and 60s. As without complete decommunization of Eastern Europe, no increasing of Europe to the east could occur. Just like in this situation, no pacification of this Euro-Asian sphere can be imagined without complete decommunization and de-totalitarianization of Russia and other post-Soviet states. It is the main problem for us. It is the main problem for our relations with Europe. It's one of the main problems of Europe, for NATO, for all the world. Thank you.
Anna-Lena, please. You have about 20 minutes as well.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a big honor to be here beside Professor Andrey Zubov. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
It works?
Yes.
Okay. It's a great honor to be here side by side with Professor Andrey Zubov, whom I interviewed in your home almost exactly a year ago in Moscow. And during this interview, which is one of the most interesting I have made so far during my career, Professor Zubov said that, as a matter of fact, although he has been kicked out of the MGIMO, the diplomatic school of Russian diplomats at the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Zubov is still a member of the President's Council on Human Rights, and you still are, you told me yesterday. So I asked Mr. Zubov, how is this possible? And he said, Anna-Lena, you understand this is not Germany. If it was Germany, we would all be dead. And I think black humor is sometimes very important for intellectuals, Russian intellectuals who live in Russia, such as Mr. Zubov, and I admire you a great deal, and I'm very happy that you stay in Russia. It's extremely important that all intellectuals don't leave Russia, because the result is nothing I would want to see. Well, you said that there was a certain period of time when Russia was considered not very interesting anymore, because because the direction seemed to be quite clear, and then it all changed. myself, I'm from Finland, but I work for the Swedish main newspaper Dagens Nyheter. I also work for Hufvudstadsbladet, as Martin Kragh told you. And in Finland, we never thought that Russia is not interesting. It's impossible if you have a border of 1,000 kilometers with Russia. And after Russia invaded Ukraine, it was very interesting to watch the reactions in Sweden and Finland respectively, how they changed, how they differed. Because in Finland was quite worried that now this happens again. We know this can happen in Russia. We know Kremlin can do such things. Sweden was upset. How is it possible that somebody can do such a thing? Or how can Russia do such a thing? And this is quite, I think, illuminating if you watch Europe, how Europe in general is relating to Russia. Myself, I started my whole love affair with Russia started in the 90s when I was studying political science at Åbo Academy and met students at St. Petersburg University. They came to Åbo, Turku, for seminars, and we went there for seminars. And I very lively remember the atmosphere at the time. In Russia nowadays, the 90s are very often seen as some sort of so-called smutное время, very bad times when there was just chaos, instability. Russia was weak. But as a matter of fact, the 90s also was a wonderful time for Russia. And I'm saying this quite aware of the fact how many people suffered in the 90s and how many people lost everything they had. But still, when I hear 20-year-old Russians telling me how the 90s was the most awful time you can ever imagine, and they never even lived through the 90s, I realized that this is an idea which is now extremely strong in Russian society, and also many people in the West have started to believe that the 90s is the fault, or that the 90s is the only reason why Putin is so strong, and it's not the only reason. I think it's very important to remember that there is no determinism when it comes to how Russia develops. There is no such thing as a fact that Russia will always stay like this, or that Russia will always be authoritarian. In the 90s, Russia was not a full-fledged democracy in any way, but the country was free. People were quite curious, and there was a very, very strong feeling that change was actually possible. I felt this in the 90s, and then almost 10 years later or more, I had the same feeling again when I was on the 10th of December 2011, when I was standing on Bolotnaya Square in Moscow in the first big demonstration against the Putin regime ever in Russia. And there were thousands of people standing on the square believing that they could do something together, that they could change the country together. This was the first time I ever had this experience in Russia, and it's still very, very strong in my mind. And I would also like to stress the fact that on those first demonstrations, there was no violence, and there was no, of course there were lots of slogans against Putin, but there was no aggressive feelings in the air. It was very much humor and a very warm feeling of everybody wanting to build a better country. And I still want to stress that this is something which is possible in Russia, but right now, of course, it's not very realistic to see big change for the near future. But I just want to stress the fact that there is no determinism when it comes to Russia and Russia's future. In the 90s, myself, I was about 20, and I met people in my age who wanted to join Europe, who wanted Russia to integrate with Europe. They wanted to become a member of the European Union, and they wanted Russia to become a member of NATO. Actually, Putin himself was talking about Russia becoming a member of NATO at the beginning of his career. Today, 20-year-olds in Russia think that Stalin was a good manager and sincerely believe that corruption is a problem in all countries, in all societies. Russia is no different in that respect. These young people have very often traveled, often speak English, or other European languages. They use internet very skillfully. They can very often be educated, and they know more or less what Stalin did. But they still always put it in the context of these were different times. Stalin did what he had to do. Stalin was very effective. Stalin made Russia and the Soviet Union great. So they realize that Stalin was a dictator, but they don't realize what a dictator is. And they don't realize that all the things they love themselves so much, all their iPhones, their skiing trips to Courchevel, shopping in Stockholm, that nothing of this would have been possible in Soviet times. The same Soviet times that they very often refer to as good times for Russia, that they have never ever experienced, but they are convinced they were good, stable times because this is what their grandmothers and grandfathers have told them. I'll just have to tell you one example. Last week I was standing outside the opposition party RPR Parnas office in Pyatnitskaya Ulitsa in central Moscow because I had an interview with Ilya Yashin, who was one of Boris Nemtsov's good friends. And there was a young girl, there was a demonstration by nationalists, and there was a young woman holding a sign saying that Nemtsov and Yashin and all the other opposition activists or leaders are fifth columns and traitors. So I asked her, why are you so much against Yashin? How exactly has Yashin betrayed his country? And she said, Yashin is one of the people who destroyed Russia in the 90s. Fact is that Yashin was born in 83. So in the 90s, he was a schoolboy. But this is something which is extremely common in Russia now. Young people are repeating all these things that they hear and read. And it's not, as many people think in the West, that all young people, for example, watch TV, state-controlled propaganda TV. Lots of people don't watch TV at all, but still believe in this. And sometimes my feeling is that it's not that for many people, it's not even that they really believe 100% in this sort of propaganda, but they think that everything is propaganda. What we say in the West is also propaganda. So we have, very often I'm told, we have our truth and you have your truth. And actually there is no truth. So everybody's right and everybody's wrong. And this sort of reasoning is extremely difficult to reason with. And I think it can only be developed in a generation which has never actually learned, how should I put it? They have never learned that history, of course, always, there are lots of different factors in history, and there are many situations in history which you can see in one way or the other way, but there still is right and wrong. There still is human rights breaches, and there are mass murders, and there are people who died in vain during Stalin, for example. This is something that they can't see because it happened also in other places. That's what they think. Gulag happened also in other places. So, and this is, I think, in a way, I don't agree when people say, or let's say, put it like this, there are lots of discussions in the West nowadays about the growing extremism, right-wing extremism in Russia. And I agree that there is a certain right-wing extremism in Russia as in Europe. But the problem is more the fact that there is a completely apolitical generation who doesn't distinguish right from wrong anymore. And right now I'm talking about the younger generation, about 20-year-old. So in a way, the younger generation at about 20 are, for me, in a way, a Soviet generation, although they know nothing about Soviet Union. And the older generation, which is maybe more than, let's say, 50 or more, are also Soviet because they lived during Soviet times. There's only a little space in ages, people maybe between 35 and 45, who are not Sovietified because they were young during the 90s and they remember what it was actually like. This is actually, saying this, I have no statistical evidence. I'm just telling you about my experiences when I meet people and speak to people. Is Russia a European country? nowadays it's extremely popular in Russia. Thank you. It's extremely popular in Russia to stress the fact that Russia is not European, Russia is not Asian, Russia is something sui generis, it's something completely of its own, and this is why nobody can understand us, and we will not follow the path of Europe nor of Asia, we will follow our own path. By and large, I think this is all rubbish. Russia is, of course, a European country, but Russia has a totalitarian tradition which distinguishes it from most other European countries, and Russia has no democratic memory. But if you look at Russian culture and Russian society, it would be nothing without Europe. And also, of course, if you look at European literature and European music, it would be a lot poorer without Russian writers and Russian composers. So I think these all discussions about Russia being so special, of course, Russia is special in many ways, and Russia for me will always be very special. But I think it's these ideas of Russia having to be different and Russia will never be able to become a democracy, I think will lead you wrong, because it's an easy way of not dealing with certain facts, such as the fact that, like, for example, during the whole time of modern Russia, including during Putin regime, Russia's most important trading partner has always been the EU. And Mr. Putin, before he crossed Rubicon by invading Ukraine, never actually did anything which could really endanger his economic ties with Europe. And Putin has always, when he speaks about Russia's role in the world and when he speaks about Russia as a country, he's always relating to Europe. Of course, he can say that China is now our very important partner. China is our new strategic partner. We have this mnogovektornaya, this multi-vector policy of trying to influence other places in the world and building alliances with other countries and other regions. But Putin really, and this is, I think, a very important factor, and it's been described very well in a brilliant new book by a Russian journalist whose name is Mikhail Zygar, who wrote a book. It's called Vya Kremlyovskaya Rat, which more or less means all the Kremlin's men, all the king's men, all the Kremlin's men. Hopefully it will be translated into English and Swedish and other European languages. What he writes about a lot is the fact that Putin is extremely hurt and insulted by the fact that he feels that he is time and again being rejected and pushed out of Europe. And it started long before the whole issue with Ukraine. And Putin, you can be of different opinions if Putin is right or wrong, but the fact that he really actually is insulted by this tells how much he would actually want Russia to be close to Europe. So all these talks nowadays about the so-called gay Europa and the fact that Europe is declining, and luckily we have our age-old Russian culture, is just talk. Putin has always, in all his policies, tried to find some sort of ways to exist together with Europe and to integrate. Integrate is the wrong word. To cooperate with Europe and to find all the economic benefits. And especially when he was at the beginning of his first presidential period, he was very much trying to build ties with, for example, Tony Blair and other European leaders. And fact is that I don't think that Putin was not honest in this process. He really wanted to build some sort of ties, and he really wanted Russia, in certain ways, he wanted Russia to become more like a European country. And one of those fears, of course, was economy. He wanted Russia to have a strong economy. He actually did some good things with the tax system. He rebuilt the new tax system and made it work a lot better than before. He had a very professional Minister of Finances, Alexei Kudrin, who was much acclaimed in the whole Western world. But Putin, the problem of Putin was that he was a Soviet person and he still is a Soviet person, and he could not accept the fact that the old interest spheres are now gone. The fact that Yalta Agreement is no longer working. It's no longer current. Nobody cares about it anymore. And if, for example, Ukraine and Georgia want to integrate with the EU, European leaders will not tell them, no, you can't, because we must think of Putin's feelings. This is what Putin is expecting Europe to do. Think about my feelings, but Europe of course doesn't do it, because EU thinks that every country has the right to decide herself or himself to what sphere to belong to, and this is something which Putin simply doesn't understand. And that's also one of the reasons why he invaded Ukraine, because he was convinced that this is one of the only ways to really prove to the Europeans that I'm serious. I would like to end my small presentation relating to some of the very interesting things Mr. Zubov said about decommunization and the idea of democracy. I think being a Soviet person doesn't necessarily mean that the person believes in communism or that the person has even lived in Soviet times. Being a Soviet person means that you never really think about what's good for the individual. You always prioritize the system. And you are always afraid of critics, and you always try to control everything. And in this respect, I must say, unfortunately, that there are other Soviet persons who believe themselves being democrats, not only in Russia, but also in Ukraine. I think Poroshenko is a genius example of a Soviet person in his way of acting and doing. And many other Ukrainian leaders as well who want to integrate Ukraine with the EU. And the difference, of course, between Ukraine and Russia doesn't have a democratic memory. Ukraine also doesn't have a democratic memory. Ukraine has never actually been a democratic country because it was always split between different empires. But Ukraine has never internalized a totalitarian way of thinking because it was always in the periphery. So, and I think this is one of the most important differences between Russia and Ukraine, that in Ukraine, the individual, the human being matters. For example, the demonstrations in Maidan, what really changed the situation during the Maidan process in Ukraine, which started in 2013, was when Yanukovych, then president, sent in his elite soldiers in order to beat the demonstrators into submission at the end of November 2013. In Russia, that would have been the end of it. But in Ukraine, people got extremely upset because he was using violence against his own citizens. And the next week, Maidan had tens of thousands of people were streaming to Maidan. And this, of course, doesn't make... Unfortunately, right now, what we're seeing in Ukraine doesn't make me very optimistic because there are other problems which have occurred. But I think this is... When I'm trying to understand for myself why Ukraine is developing like this and Russia is not, I think this is one of the most important reasons. But having standed on Bolotnaya Square and in a number of other demonstrations in Moscow, listening to or watching smart, educated Moscovites with a great sense of humor demanding an open, better democratic country, I do believe that. I know that Russia is not a country which is destined always to be under a regime like Putin's or not being democratic. But there's another fact is the fact that Russia has never been democratic, and it's a very long and painful way to go. And with all these Soviet phenomena coming back, not communist but Soviet, we now know that it will take a lot longer time than we hoped. I'm very often asked, especially in Sweden, what can we do to help Russia? What can we do to help Russian opposition? And to be honest, I don't think there's anything the West actually can do to make Russia more democratic. The change has to come from within. And right now, for the next, let's say, 5 or 6 years, I see very small possibilities for change. But there will be a change sooner or later, because this is the way Russia has always gone. There has always been changes in a certain period of time. And I hope that these changes will be peaceful. And I also hope that there will be that the Russian opposition will not make the same mistake as the Ukrainian opposition has made with this infighting and splitting and only thinking about your own interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of you. In fact, this day marks the 60th anniversary of Nikita Khrushchev's speech to the 20th Party Congress, where he denounced the cult of personality and he denounced the crimes, at least some of them, of Joseph Stalin. And as you mentioned and you refer to in your speeches, the legacy of history is unpredictable, because even today, 60 years after Khrushchev's speech, busts of Stalin are being resurrected in Russia. I think that we should open up the floor for the auditorium to pose questions. I see a few hands in the air. We have colleagues ready with the microphones. Please, okay, vill du ge en till herren i mitten här? And please state your name.
Okay, my name is Robert Joknik, and we have a company in Russia since many years. 2 questions to you. The fact that Russia has become more authoritative, does it mean that Russia in the end will end up where China is, being a full-fledged dictatorship? Because with democracy just being not there, it seems it goes that way. The next question is that when Putin will get more and more desperate because the economy in Russia goes down and is going to go down much further than it is today, the middle class is almost wiped out in Russia today. Will he then be more desperate and do more aggressive things internationally just to take away the problem at home?
I see.
And if I may suggest that we take one more question from the audience, and so you can answer 2 questions at the same time, or Anna-Lena and you can share them between yourselves. All right, I see a hand here in the air.
My name is Kjell Lundqvist. First, I actually must comment, China is no dictatorship, that's just bullshit. Next thing, you have a mass murderer sitting in the White House in Washington, and then you are thinking about why Putin tried to defend Russia. As everybody in this audience should know, is that the Western Alliance is trying to prevent or see that the world is on a polar and nobody shall challenge their way to do what they want in the world. And this is the reason why Putin acted like this. And you are saying about right and wrong. If you now have a certain praising of the Yeltsin era, go to workers and farmers in the old Soviet Union and ask them what they think about the Yeltsin era, or to the university professors on that time. How much salary did they got in the time between 91 and 98? Ask them that. Then you understand why.
Please, yes, may I ask you to finalize?
Yeah, then you can understand why Putin is acting like he is now to save Russia from the unipolar world.
All right, thank you. Well, you were a professor in the 90s.
Yes, I was a professor in the 90s.
And if you remember, you can
Of course I remember everything.
Should we take the first question first?
Yes.
From Mr.
You see, first question was about dictatorship. If Russia will be a complete dictatorial state as China is. First of all, I am sure that continental China, communist China, is of course a dictatorship. Of course, it's not like in the 1960s, it's absolutely different system, but of course it's not a democratic, not a liberal country, and not a free country. It's clear to me. I think not. I think not. It's very difficult to build a complete totalitarian state in a market economy. You remember that Nazi regime turned from market economy to organized economy step by step. And as to fascist Italy, it failed to build complete totalitarian state. It was semi-totalitarian state in Italy. I think that Russia will try to follow this pattern. But Russian situation is much worse than situation in Italy and Germany, since there are no friends of Russia. You see, it was Germany, Italy, Japan, it's an anti-communist pact, nothing like this. If we have anti-American pact, it's only Iran, North Korea, and maybe in some words Venezuela. It's not very strong countries. And that's why the decline, Italian economics and German economics were increased before war, during the Nazi regime. And Russian economics is now in decline, and nothing can be imagined why it will improve except price for oil. But if we have economics absolutely dependent from oil, it's a very weak economics. It's understandable. It's the first question, your first question. And the second one, I'm sorry, your second question.
Will Putin be more desperate when the economy worsens?
Yes.
And then be even more unpredictable?
Yes, yes. I think that now Mr. Putin or all this Kremlin elite are in search of way out from the situation it found itself after Ukraine, after annexation of Crimea. Because Putin imagined absolutely different situation after the annexation of Crimea. He was sure that, I remember his words turned to be well known when in February in the middle of February, this perspective of annexation of Crimea was discussed in the Presidential Council. Some people say that it's very dangerous. Your obligation, answered Putin, is to minimize risks, and all things design. All design is myself, so answered Putin to them. So I will recommend you policy, and you only ought to minimize risks of this policy. And now we see that these friends of Putin were right, and he saw it very well. So now it's a problem how to go away from it. It's not the idea of build more and more strong anti-Western state or anti-Western coalition. It's impossible. The only way how to re-establish good relations with the West without losing things which were taken during these 2 years. It's a problem. And nobody knows in Kremlin what to do with it, how to solve this problem. So I think that it's unwise to think that the regime will be more crude and more totalitarian than it is now. Maybe just an opposite way we can imagine. But to say frankly, I can't catch your question clearly, the third one.
It was more of a statement, perhaps, than a
It was
question.
statement,
But
yes.
I think we
it
heard,
was statement.
we heard it, and
so
we can think
each
about it.
statement with the person who proclaimed it.
All right. Anna-Lena, would you like to chime in?
If I can just add a little thing, there was the gentleman here saying that the middle class is being wiped out, which is a misunderstanding. It's not being wiped out yet. The decline is real, and the middle class is consuming a lot less. Wages are going down, prices are going up, but there's no collapse as for now.
No collapse, no.
And we also must remember that when Russia declines economically, people are used to things getting worse and worse. It's not things which we think are a catastrophe. Oh, you can't go to the Canary Islands this year. It's not a catastrophe for many people in Russia. So, of course, at the end of the day, it will people will react, but we're not there yet. Yeah. So,
We are not there yet.
I don't hope.
Because you said yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't hope anything. I'm a journalist. I'm just, watching. But if there will be no change at some stage, of course, there will be real economical problems. But we are not there yet.
So I will take the word from my husband. My name is Elizabeth Hedborg. I would like to go back to what you said, Professor Zubov, about the problems of Russia today, having to do with the absence of decommunization of the country. I would think there is another great problem also, is the fact that common Russians never felt or perceived themselves as citizens. They always, even in the 80s and the 90s, they perceived themselves as subjects of somebody. How come they never reached this situation of feeling themselves as fully citizens who can create their own society? Why they didn't feel that, and what can make them feel or become citizens in order to change things?
Yes, it's a very deep and serious question. Of course, you are absolutely right. The consciousness of citizens who ought to answer themselves for the problems which are in front of them and try to solve these problems is absent in Russia now. But it was before revolution, when this self-government was very strong in rural and in city areas, I mean Zemstva and city self-government organizations. It was completely destructed by Bolsheviks. The first thing which they destructed in the January 1918 was local self-government. I think that this absence of citizenship mind in Russia is not a historical form of Russian collective consciousness, but is a form which was emerged in Russia because of totalitarian rule. That's why normal practice is for all people to solve their problems themselves. I think, yes, you are right, that now the majority of Russian people are waiting for Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin ought to solve our problems, not we. So it's not a consciousness of citizens. You remember this situation, maybe somebody heard about it, but it was a tragic situation in a road in Orenburg region in the southern Siberia. During the winter time, many cars were stopped because of snow, and people were waiting for some assistance from the state, from police, no assistance was. So they tried to do themselves something. One, I suppose, person died was died, and some persons were terribly frozen because at that moment. But in this terrible situation, consciousness of people start to change. They start to understand that nobody will help them. You see, today's European consciousness of citizenship produced not by French Revolution, but in Middle Ages, when nobody could help local communities, and they ought to organize their lives themselves. From that time, I suppose in Sweden and in other places of Europe, people began to try to organize their lives themselves. I hope that step by step, follow Western partners, of course, also, Russia will turn to this way, because dictator never does anything to the people. He always will take from the people. And when people understand it in Russia, so this hope for good Tsar disappear.
This is very interesting. Thank you very much. That was really, you put it very well, and I would like to add that there are some things which I still have difficulties to understand, some paradoxes in Russia. Because on the one hand, you are right that there are many people who are passive and just hope that somebody else, the state or Putin or somebody else, will solve the problems. But there is also a huge innovativeness, and people are very good at solving their own problems. Absolutely. In many ways, and you can just go to regular Russian dacha and see how problems have been solved in the bathroom. You understand that this is really a creative person or creative people. So, but every time, and this is only my personal experience, very often, every time you start to talk to somebody about how to solve problems of the country, they will say, in a way, people will feel very smart telling you that you as a Westerner think you can solve these problems, but we as Russians know that they will never be solved and this will go on forever. And people really want to feel smart when they say it. Sometimes for me it's as if they are in a way feeling saved by their own smartness. We are too intelligent to be fooled, into believing that we can change anything. We are too smart, so nothing will change. This is a sort of reasoning I've heard many times in Russia.
We have a question here on the second row.
Hello, my name is Simonas Genfilas, a liberal politician from Lithuania. My question is concerning Saturday. Saturday will be 1 year after Boris Nemtsov was killed. And the question is the following. How much did this scare the opposition and the NGOs in Russia? And how do you see the development after this political murder? And did it change somehow the opposition mindset? Thank you.
Yes, in some way situation changed. You see, before this terrible event a year ago, before the murder of Nemtsov, the majority of politicians in Russia, both in opposition and close to Kremlin, they understood these political relations as game. Rather dangerous game, but game. And since I was in close relations with many leaders of opposition, I saw it. And after this murder, absolutely, this consciousness absolutely changed. They understand that it is a real and very dangerous struggle between regime and people who want to liberate country. And the price in the struggle is a human life. And everybody turned to be much more serious. And people who are afraid, they prefer to leave the country and to live abroad. But those who continue to be in Russia, they understand very well that each day they may be killed as Boris Nemtsov. For example, just in May, last May, you know, other politician, Vladimir Kara-Murza, young man, but the member of political council of Parnas party, who for many years worked and studied in Oxford, then lived in the United States. He returned to Russia for political activity and he was poisoned. Terribly. 5%. Doctors said that there were only 5% from 100, yes, that he will not die. He did not die. And now, though he is not in a complete good form, he, in his 35 years, can move only with a stick, but he returned to Russia and continues this work and could turn to be again one of the most active members of Parnas. So everybody, not only opposite politicians, but a large circle of politically interested persons understand now that if you are in oppositional politics now, it's not for money, it's not for fun, it is for a real serious task to re-establish Russia as a democratic and European country.
We have...
Can I just...
Yes, of course.
Sorry. I agree completely, and I just wanted to add one of the most important things I think Boris Nemtsov ever said when he was asked by someone, why don't you just leave Russia? Why do you stay here fighting for something which will never be fulfilled? And Nemtsov's answer was, I love Russia. Why should I leave? Let them leave. And typical Nemtsov way of expressing himself, you know, he was very flamboyant and very courageous, and he paid dearly for it. I just want to add that last week I interviewed Ilya Yashin, who was one of his close comrades in Parnas, and both Yashin and also Dmitry Gurkov, who is one of the last opposition MPs in the Russian State Duma, say that Nemtsov was very important not only because he was a leader. Of course, everybody in this audience knows that Nemtsov wasn't very popular at the end of his career among Russians. He would never have become a big popular leader again, I don't think so. But he was still a very strong leader within the opposition, and he was a very good negotiator. His role in negotiating between fighting factions within the oppositions, which is one of the Russian opposition's biggest problems, was crucial. And now there's nobody who can actually make fighting wills. There's nobody who is as good as finding common ground as Nemtsov was, and that's a very big loss.
Thank you. I have a question primarily for Anna-Lena Laurén. Having a common border with Russia of 1,000 kilometers, it stands to reason that for Finland, Russia is always interesting. I have a dual question having to do with recent events. One which is widely reported in Finnish media, including in your paper, Hufvudstadsbladet. There appears to be a pattern of Russian acquisition of property in Finland, including in Helsinki, sometimes adjacent to military installations. Sometimes this is given a rather sinister interpretation, and I would like to hear your take on that.
In Helsinki?
Of course, including Helsinki.
Because, okay, and
yes.
What's the other question?
Second question, unrelated, but related to the vicinity of Russia and to an issue which is very prominent in Swedish politics right now, migration flows. In our understanding, Finland used to be a staunch supporter of the Dublin Convention until recently. Maybe this is unfair, but the interpretation is that as long as migration flows came primarily from the south, ended up possibly to Sweden, but hardly ever to Finland, Finland remained a staunch supporter of the Dublin Convention. Now, when there appears to be a different threat, a threat of a flood of migrants from Russia, not necessarily or not primarily Russian citizens, but from across the Russian border. There seems to be a change of policy in Finland on Dublin. I'm not interested only in Dublin, but in your assessment of this perceived threat in Finland.
Okay, I will start with last questions, just in short, because it's really not the theme of our discussion. But the refugees which have been coming from Russia to Finland so far have not been extremely numerous. I think we're talking about a couple of thousands. And most of them have been turned back almost immediately. And there's no need to change the Dublin Convention for Finland in order to do that, because it's very easy to just state the fact that they have been living in Russia for 20 years, so probably they're not in a great need of asylum. But of course there are lots of political wills in Finland who want to change the whole system, but that's a bit of another issue. Your first questions about Russian acquisitions in Finland, when it comes to Helsinki, the big discussions has not been about Helsinki, it has been about the East, where a number of Russian citizens have acquired plots, summer cottages and plots and lands. And there are many people, also researchers and academics in Finland, who think that this is a security threat and that Finland should be a lot less naive when it comes to selling plots to Russian citizens without checking who they actually are. So it's a big issue, and already Finland's last president Tarja Halonen took it up with Dmitry Medvedev, the then president of Russia, saying that it's a bit strange that your citizens buy lands in border areas, whereas we are not allowed to buy lands in the border areas on the Russian side. But right now, since Russia has no money, or Russian citizens have a lot less money, there are less people buying, so it's been calming down a bit.
All right, we have a question here in the back. And please state your name.
Yes, Gustav Foghammar. I just wanted to have some comments concerning the synergistic relation towards America and dysfunctional conflict, and if the aggression is some kind of reaction or paranoid reaction in Russia towards some neoconservative ideologies in Washington or something like that. Yeah.
Did you...
You mean Russian aggression against Ukraine was a paranoid reaction? You say about this, yes?
Yes, and in general, I think.
Sorry?
And in general. I think Ukraine,
in general?
Yes, in general and about Ukraine.
I think not. You see, this Putin's reaction toward Maidan was in some way unpredictable, but in another way very predictable, because I remember the reaction of Kremlin administration. At that time I was in the close circle and discussing some political brainstormings with some specialists from Kremlin elite, the situation after Yushchenko came to power, you remember, in 2006, just 10 years ago, this first Maidan. It was panic. It was panic in Russia because everybody afraid that in Russia will be something like this. And the main problem was, of course, the problem of property. Power, because it's necessary to understand that, for example, in the United States, money may be converted into property, into power, into political power. Money may be converted into political power. But in Russia, vice versa, power may be converted into money. It's not for fun. It's really so. You see, it's necessary to understand this simple fact. That's why if elite lose power, it loses everything, even their freedom, maybe, and found themselves as Tymoshenko in prison at last. Yes, that's why it was panic in 2006, and again, when Putin saw the second Maidan, it was again panic, and it's necessary to understand one more element. Because here, for example, in democratic society with tradition of citizens' activism in politics, nobody will surprise on some demonstration. But in Russia, as a successor of Soviet Union, in the minds of people with KGB origin, it's people cannot organize something themselves. They cannot organize some demonstrations, some barricades, etc. Somebody ordered them. Somebody paid them. Everything is organized by the enemies. There is a struggle between large states, for example, Soviet Union and the United States, and, for example, Ukraine and East Europe is only a play of game. And in this consciousness, what occurred in Ukraine, it's something which was organized by whom? Of course, United States. United States, maybe Poland as assistant, somebody else, I don't know. And I'm sorry. And that's why Putin thinks that it's necessary to struggle not with Ukraine, but of course with the United States. But it is impossible to struggle with the United States because the United States is too strong. So he decided to struggle in Ukraine with the United States. That was the decision. And as you remember, everybody said at that time, we annexed Crimea because if we didn't do so, Sevastopol turned to be American or NATO base, etc., etc. So everything was around this.
Anna-Lena.
Yeah, I would just like to add that this really is a strategic mistake that the Kremlin is doing over and over and over again, being completely convinced that small countries never have a will of their own and are never able to solve things of their own. It's always somebody else which decides for them. And this is also why the Kremlin has never bothered to use soft power in Georgia, for example, or in Ukraine. A very good example, when I was in Georgia a couple of years ago, last time, I was told by a lecturer of philosophy at the Tbilisi State University that we get she told me we have lots of books, literature from other countries. They give us literature, academic literature for free, donations. And I said, so do you get any from Russia? Because I want to stress that there are still lots of Georgians who speak Russia eloquently. She said, no. Russia, and this was before the war, I don't know, but anyway, Russia doesn't even bother to send academic literature to a country where so many people speak Russian. And this is a policy which goes on and on and on. They never, using soft power and trying to make countries themselves want to belong to the Russian hemisphere is something which they simply do not understand in the Kremlin.
All right, I've seen a few hands, yes. I think actually you were before, so...
Okay, my name is Jan Sigman. I have a question about the Russian policy. We have not spoken much about Georgia and the Russian policies. Actually, it was a casus belli for war. So how much should we be concerned with Russian policies and coming policies? I mean, right now, Ukraine, there is some kind of ceasefire, but can we expect more of this kind of policies like in Lithuania and Baltic states and even in Finland? Should we be afraid? Should we? What can we do about it? Is NATO the answer, or is it soft policies like in München when we just say, oh, okay, we write some kind of ceasefire argument and then everything will be fine, and we know what happened. It's now our time.
Okay, we can take the second question.
Maybe, but I always, I'm an age person, I forget. Just now I remembered the question of you about, about my personal as a professor life during 90s. It was materially difficult. Yes. We even, I had at that time 3 small children. and it was a problem to even to have enough food for them. But we feel wonderful freedom, possibility to write what you think, to speak in lectures what you think. And for intellectuals, it's a great achievement. And I was ready at that time to pay this price of personal poverty for this freedom. Of course, not all Russian people were ready, but for intellectuals it was so. It's my answer to your question. And as to possibility of continuation of aggression toward other states, I think it depends of Europe. If Europe and NATO allow situation in Ukraine be conservated, if de facto, of course not de jure, but de facto, Crimea was accepted as a Russian territory, if sanctions were declined and disappeared without complete solving of Ukrainian problem towards the Minsk II agreements, we can imagine other ways of aggression. Because we have an example. In 2008, ethnical disturbances in Georgia produced Russian invasion into Ossetia and Abkhazia. And at that time, Western world accepted it, prefer to neglect this situation. And in 6 years, we saw Ukraine. So now, and I know that in some European countries, there are voices that, I heard this voice myself in France, for example, that it's necessary to finish these sanctions, it's unuseful, it's better to re-emerge good relations with Russia, we ought to understand Russia, we ought to accept its Russians' interests. If Europe go in this direction, something again will occur in 4 or 6 years. I don't know where.
Yeah, I'll just, in short, I will reply with regard to the risk of, for example, the Baltic countries and Finland being invaded. The Baltic countries are NATO members, and we must remember that if you look at the last invasions of Georgia and then Ukraine that Russia has made, they have both been pretty easy targets with no functioning armies and so on. Putin is not interested in wars that he cannot win. Finland is no NATO member, but Finland has a very good defense. Of course, if Russia would really try, Finland would probably not stand it, but Putin knows he would get a bloody nose anyway. So I don't think he will take that risk. Yeah.
Okay, we have, you're waiting with the microphone.
Yes, my name is Ingmar Ullberg at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. I'd like to build on the previous question.
Please speak into the mic.
Yes. Could you say something more about the Russian attitude to violence and war in general? We see this militarization that has been going on for several years. We see these celebrations of the victory in the Second World War. We see this support for the war in Ukraine and now in Syria. How far do you think this can go, and what support does it have among the people? Is there any other way to put an end to this than that you say that there is harsh resistance or even a Russian defeat?
Yes, it's a large question. You see, the mass consciousness of Russian people lives with great trauma trauma because during the Soviet period, one of the main principles of propaganda was that we are a very strong country. The Soviet Union is the second and maybe the first, one of two most strongest countries of the world. And Soviet government didn't give much to the people. The level of life was rather low, not as in the United States. But people compensate this low level of life with the idea of strength of the state. It was old song. You see, during the pre-revolutionary times, even during the serfdom, always say that we are a strong country. We are a very strong and very large country. Strong and large. 1/6 of the world. I don't remember that Great Britain very often say at that time British Empire is 1/4 of the world. But it was 1/4 of the world. But we always say we are 1/6 of the world. We are a very strong country. And you remember this total fiasco of this idea in Crimean War in this middle of 19th century. After this collapse of communism, common people took nothing from the revolution, because this freedom of speech, of taking information, all this is for intellectuals. The possibility to be rich is for former Soviet elite who turned to be rich. And the majority of people who were proletarians without no property during the Soviet time, they continued to be absolutely poor or without property in the post-communist times. And the only idea was the empire, the strength of the country. And even this sweet was taken from them. They had no empire. And now Putin returned this sweet. We're empire, with great army, with great fleet. You continue to be poor, we continue to be rich, but country will be strong and everybody would afraid it. It's wonderful. As during the Stalin time, people lived in terrible conditions, but everybody was afraid. I always say, you see, yes, this effect was successfully occurred, but you ought to imagine what is it. If you have a bandit, some person or robber in your street, everybody will afraid him. But but nobody will think that he is a good person or will want to have some relations with him. Situation with today's Russia is the same. Yes, we have nuclear weapons, everybody afraid us, but nothing else. Nothing else. So I think that if in 90s real decommunization had taken place in Russia, and simple people would take some property, they understood that the new regime is much better than communist one. And now they think with some nostalgia to communist regime, because it was absolutely the same for them as it was during the communist time.
Andrey Zubov, Anna-Lena, Laurén, time has gone very quickly.
I'm sorry.
And no, we are grateful for both your presentations, your discussions, and I thank the audience, and we thank the speakers again.
I'm sorry to take time as my own property.